Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I thought I was helping my parents by exposing my sister's lies, but somehow, I became the villain in the family. Now they're asking me to share the inheritance with her, and I don't know if I can ever forgive them. It all started about 3 years ago, on an unassuming Sunday afternoon. My family had gathered for a barbecue at my parents' house, one of those casual get-togethers where everyone talks over each other. Laughter is constant, and the smell of grilled burgers fills the air. Megan, my younger sister, showed up late, which wasn't unusual for her. What was unusual was the heavy, almost somber expression on her face. As we sat around the patio table, Megan asked for everyone's attention. She hesitated for a moment, looking down at her hands, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been diagnosed with cancer." The world seemed to freeze. My dad's fork clattered onto his plate, and my mom immediately burst into tears. Megan went on to explain that it was stage 3 lymphoma. She assured us she was fighting it, but the treatments were expensive, and she might need help. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Megan had always been the vibrant, carefree one in the family. The idea of her dealing with something so serious didn't feel real. My parents reacted exactly as you'd expect loving parents to. My mom started crying harder, apologizing for all the petty arguments they'd ever had. My dad asked 100 questions. "What's the prognosis? How long have you known? What do you need from us?" Megan, ever the performer, played the part perfectly. She said she didn't want to burden us, that she hadn't even planned on telling us yet, but the stress of managing everything on her own had become too much. "Of course, we'll help," my mom said, wiping her tears. "Whatever you need, sweetheart, we'll make it work." My dad nodded solemnly, already talking about dipping into their savings. Megan, feigning reluctance, admitted she'd need help covering her medical bills and living expenses since she wouldn't be able to work during treatment. At first, I didn't say much. I was too stunned to process everything. But as Megan continued to talk, I noticed something odd. She never mentioned where she was being treated or the name of her doctor. When I asked, she waved it off, saying she didn't want to get into the nitty-gritty. That was the first little alarm bell in my head, though I quickly shoved it aside. Over the next few days, my parents sprang into action. My dad looked into selling off some stocks, and my mom started planning ways to be there for Megan, like cooking meals for her and offering to drive her to appointments. Megan soaked up all the attention, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my gut. She looked perfectly fine, better than fine, actually. She was still posting pictures of herself out with friends, smiling and looking healthy. When I mentioned this, she snapped at me. "Not everyone looks sick when they have cancer," she said. "Do you think I'm faking this?" Her tone was so sharp, it made me feel terrible for even thinking it. But the doubts lingered. She didn't show any medical reports, didn't talk about side effects, and seemed more defensive than open about her condition. Every time I brought up a question, she'd brush me off with something like, "Why don't you trust me?" Or, "I'm already dealing with enough without you doubting me." It worked for a while. I felt so guilty for questioning her that I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. The turning point came when Megan mentioned that she might need more help than just covering her medical bills. She hinted that she might need a place to stay because she'd be too weak to live on her own. My parents immediately offered to let her move back home, even though their house was barely big enough for the two of them. They were even talking about downsizing to free up more money for her. I wanted to be supportive, but I couldn't ignore how rushed and vague everything felt. Megan had always been dramatic, even manipulative, but this was on a whole other level. Still, the idea that she could lie about something as serious as cancer seemed too outrageous to be true. I decided to push my doubts to the back of my mind, for my family's sake. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The first few weeks after Megan's bombshell were a whirlwind of family meetings, financial discussions, and emotional breakdowns. My parents were entirely focused on helping her, barely sparing a thought for their own needs. They insisted that her health came first and that they'd figure everything else out later. Megan didn't object to this, of course. She seemed to bask in their attention, even as she played the part of the stoic, selfless patient who hated to be a burden. But cracks started to appear in her story sooner than I expected. For one, her treatments seemed inconsistent at best. She told us she was undergoing chemotherapy, which, as far as I understood, was grueling and often left patients exhausted and nauseous. But Megan? She was anything but bettered. One day, she claimed she had chemo and couldn't get out of bed, begging my parents for extra help with groceries or errands. The next day, her Instagram would show her sipping cocktails at a trendy rooftop bar or hiking with friends. When I questioned her about it, she'd always have an excuse. I'm trying to live my life while I still can, or my doctor says I need to keep my spirits up. It didn't sit right with me, but my parents ate it up. The turning point came when I offered to go with her to one of her doctor's appointments. It seemed like a reasonable request. I wanted to support her, to see firsthand what she was going through. But as soon as I brought it up, her demeanor shifted completely. "You don't need to come," she snapped, her voice tight. "It's not a big deal. I can handle it. I just thought—" I said no. She interrupted, her tone sharp enough to make me flinch. Then she softened, as if realizing she'd overplayed her hand. "Look, it's really personal, okay? I don't want anyone seeing me like that." It didn't make sense. Megan had never been the type to shy away from attention, even in her most vulnerable moments. In fact, she thrived on being the center of things. Her reaction felt off, but I let it go for the moment, not wanting to stir up more tension. The more I watched, the more the inconsistencies piled up. Megan claimed she was too sick to work, yet her lifestyle didn't seem to reflect any kind of financial struggle. She was still buying designer clothes, going on weekend trips, and dining at expensive restaurants. When I asked her how she was managing it, she waved me off. "My friends have been really supportive," she said vaguely. "They've helped out a lot." It didn't add up. Megan wasn't exactly known for her close, supportive friendships. Most of her relationships were superficial, built on convenience rather than real connection. The idea that these friends were funding her lifestyle out of the goodness of their hearts didn't seem plausible. Meanwhile, my parents were burning through their savings at an alarming rate. My dad had cashed out part of his retirement fund, and my mom had started selling off some family heirlooms to cover Megan's medical expenses. When I expressed concern, they brushed it off. "She's our daughter," my mom said firmly. "What else can we do?" I felt like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Every time I tried to voice my doubts, I was met with resistance. My parents accused me of being cold or unsupportive. Megan, of course, played the victim flawlessly, making me feel like the worst person in the world for even questioning her. The tipping point came one evening when I overheard a phone call between Megan and my mom. Megan was crying, saying she needed more money for a new, experimental treatment her insurance wouldn't cover. My mom, in tears herself, promised to find a way to help. After the call, I confronted my mom. "Don't you think it's strange that Megan never talks about her doctor or shows us any paperwork?" I asked. My mom sighed, clearly exhausted. "She's going through so much. The last thing she needs is us doubting her." "But what if—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I can't handle the idea that she might not be telling the truth. I just can't." Her words left me speechless. It was as if my parents had willingly blindfolded themselves, refusing to see what was right in front of them. And Megan knew it. She was playing on their love and guilt, exploiting their willingness to do anything for their child. At this point, I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else to get to the bottom of things. If I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. I started keeping a closer eye on Megan, looking for any concrete proof of her illness or lack thereof. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The decision to dig deeper into Megan's claims wasn't one I made lightly. I spent weeks battling my own guilt and self-doubt, questioning whether I was a terrible sibling for even considering that she might be lying. But the inconsistencies in her story and the toll it was taking on my parents pushed me to act. If I was wrong, I'd apologize and live with the shame. But if I was right, well, I wasn't ready to think about that yet. The first step in my investigation was straightforward. Megan had mentioned the name of the hospital she claimed to be receiving treatment at, a reputable facility known for its oncology department. I called them, pretending to check on a relative. My heart pounded as I waited on hold, feeling like a detective in a bad movie. When the receptionist finally came back on the line, she told me there was no record of anyone with Megan's name receiving treatment there. I asked her to double-check, my voice trembling, but the answer was the same. No Megan. No cancer treatments. Nothing. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. A part of me had been hoping I'd hear something, anything, that would prove me wrong. But instead, I was left with a gaping void where my trust in Megan used to be. Still, I couldn't confront her with just this one piece of evidence. Megan was cunning and manipulative, and I knew she'd find a way to explain it away. I needed more proof, something undeniable. That's when I decided to turn to social media. Megan had always been active on Instagram, posting pictures of her life in vivid detail. I spent hours combing through her feed, paying closer attention than I ever had before. The more I looked, the clearer the picture became. She was living it up, Fancy dinners, spa days, weekend getaways. She didn't look like someone battling a life-threatening illness. Her captions were full of hashtags like hashtag living my best life and hashtag no regrets. One post in particular stood out, a picture of her at a beachside resort, drink in hand, with the caption, "Can't let life get me down." The nail in the coffin came when I stumbled upon a comment from one of her friends. Under a picture of Megan holding shopping bags from a high-end boutique, the friend wrote, "Megan's the queen of hustle." It hit me like a punch to the gut. Hustle had always been Megan's code word for scheming. When we were kids, she'd brag about hustling other kids out of their lunch money or getting teachers to give her extensions on homework. The comment wasn't just a clue. It was a confession hidden in plain sight. My stomach churned as I pieced it all together. Megan wasn't sick. She wasn't undergoing chemotherapy. She wasn't spending my parents' money on medical bills. She was scamming them, and all of us, to fund her extravagant lifestyle. But now that I knew the truth, the question was, what was I going to do about it? For a few days, I debated my next move. A small, almost pathetic part of me clung to the idea that I might be wrong, that there was some explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew better. The facts didn't lie, and Megan had left a trail of breadcrumbs too damning to ignore. I considered confronting her directly, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. Megan was a master manipulator, and without solid proof, she'd turn the tables on me in an instant. I'd seen her do it before, twisting lies into truths and making everyone else look like the villain. Instead, I decided to gather every piece of evidence I could find. I screenshotted her Instagram posts, archived comments from her friends, and saved the call logs from the hospital. I even reached out to one of her old roommates, who confirmed my suspicions by saying Megan had been bragging about figuring out a way to make bank without working. Armed with this information, I started preparing myself for the inevitable confrontation, not just with Megan, but with my parents. They were the real victims in all of this, pouring their hearts and savings into what they thought was a desperate fight for their daughter's life. How would they react when they found out it was all a lie? The thought of breaking their hearts made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't let Megan keep getting away with it. Every day that passed, she was draining them dry, emotionally and financially. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in her scam. I told myself I was doing the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. As I prepared to confront Megan, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into the unknown. This wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about protecting my parents from someone they loved, a daughter they trusted implicitly. And I had no idea how they'd react when I shattered the illusion Megan had so carefully crafted. Confronting Megan wasn't something I took lightly. I spent days preparing myself for the encounter, running through every possible scenario in my head. What if she denied everything? What if she turned it around on me? What if I couldn't keep my cool? But the more I thought about my parents, the sacrifices they'd made, the pain they'd endured believing their daughter was fighting for her life, the more certain I became that I had to do this. They deserved the truth, even if it shattered them. I showed up at Megan's apartment on a Saturday afternoon, unannounced. She wasn't expecting me, which was exactly what I wanted. I knew if I gave her any warning, she'd have time to concoct another lie. When she opened the door, she looked surprised but not alarmed. "Oh, hey," she said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What brings you here?" I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I laid out everything I'd found: the hospital call, her Instagram posts, the comments from her friends. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from casual indifference to something I couldn't quite place. Shock? Fear? Guilt? When I mentioned calling the hospital, her face went pale. For a moment, I thought I'd finally cornered her, that she'd realize there was no way out and confess. But Megan was nothing if not resourceful. She quickly recovered, crossing her arms and narrowing her eyes at me. "Are you serious right now?" she snapped. "You've been spying on me? Calling hospitals and stalking my social media? That's so messed up." Her deflection was almost impressive. "Almost. This isn't about me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This is about you lying to mom and dad and scamming them out of their money. They're on the verge of selling their house, Megan. You have to stop." She rolled her eyes, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. "The hospital must have made a mistake," she said. "Or maybe you called the wrong one. Did you even think of that?" "I didn't call the wrong hospital," I said firmly. "I double-checked. There's no record of you being treated for cancer. So, unless you can show me some proof right now, I'm not buying it." For a moment, there was silence. Megan looked at me like she was calculating her next move, weighing whether to double down on her lie or cut her losses. Finally, she sighed and sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Fine, she muttered, her voice barely audible. You're right. I don't have cancer. Hearing her admit it was like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already known the truth. I sat down across from her, waiting for her to explain herself. I didn't know what else to do, she said, her voice shaking. I was desperate. I was behind on rent, my credit cards were maxed out, and I didn't have anyone to turn to. Mom and Dad were always so willing to help when they thought it was serious, so I made it serious. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her betrayal. I felt a surge of anger rise in me, but I forced myself to stay calm. You let them believe you were dying, I said, my voice cold. Do you have any idea what that's done to them? What they've given up for you? She flinched but didn't respond. Instead, she started crying, big, dramatic sobs that I wasn't sure were genuine. You can't tell them, she said, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. It would destroy them. They've been through so much already. Please, just let me fix this on my own. Her plea caught me off guard. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I thought about my parents. My mom crying herself to sleep, my dad working overtime to make ends meet, and any trace of pity evaporated. They deserve to know the truth, I said firmly. You've been lying to them for months, Megan. They're tearing their lives apart for you. How can you let that continue? She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she just kept begging. Please, she said, grabbing my hands. I'll figure something out. I'll pay them back. Just don't tell them. Please. I stood up, shaking my head. You've left me no choice, I said. If you won't come clean, then I will. As I left her apartment, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, even a twisted sense of relief that the truth was finally out. But I also knew the hardest part was still ahead. Telling my parents the truth would be like dropping a bomb on their lives. I didn't know how they'd react. Would they believe me? Would they blame me? Or worse, would they find a way to excuse Megan's actions? Whatever happened, I knew one thing for sure. This confrontation was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. Breaking the news to my parents felt like preparing for battle, with no clear way to win. I knew what I had to say would shatter them, but the alternative, allowing Megan's lies to continue eating away at their lives, wasn't an option. I couldn't let her deceit ruin them, no matter how much I wished someone else could be the bearer of this horrible truth. I waited for a Sunday evening, a time when they were usually relaxed and together. They had just finished dinner and were sitting in the living room, my dad with a newspaper and my mom scrolling on her tablet. The scene was painfully ordinary, a snapshot of the calm before the storm. Can we talk? I asked, my voice betraying my nerves. My mom looked up, concerned, while my dad folded his newspaper and set it aside. What's wrong, honey? My mom asked. I took a deep breath and sat down across from them, holding my phone in my hands like a lifeline. It's about Megan. There's something you need to know. I started from the beginning, laying out everything as clearly and carefully as I could. I told them about the hospital call, the lack of records, and the inconsistencies in Megan's story. I explained how her social media posts didn't match up with someone undergoing chemotherapy and how I'd gathered screenshots and logs to back up my suspicions. My mom's face went pale, and my dad's brows knitted together in confusion. What are you saying? My dad asked, his voice unusually quiet. I'm saying Megan isn't sick, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. She's been lying about having cancer. For a moment, there was silence, heavy and suffocating. Then my mom shook her head vigorously, as if trying to dispel what she'd just heard. That's impossible, she said. Why would she lie about something like that? She wouldn't do that to us. She did, I said, pulling up the hospital call logs on my phone. I called the hospital myself. They have no record of her being treated there. My mom's disbelief quickly turned to anger. How could you? How could you invade her privacy like that? She's going through so much. And you? Mom, stop, I said firmly, cutting her off. I didn't want to believe it either, but the facts don't lie. She's not getting treatment. She's not sick. She admitted it to me. That stopped her in her tracks. She admitted it, my dad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. I confronted her, and she confessed. She said she made it up because she needed money. She thought the only way you'd help her was if it was life or death. My dad went completely still, his eyes fixed on the floor. My mom, on the other hand, looked at me like I'd just slapped her. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice trembling. Do you hate her that much? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This isn't about hate, I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. This is about the truth. She's been lying to you, taking your money, and letting you believe she's dying. How can you defend that? It wasn't until I showed them the proof that the weight of my words began to sink in. I handed my phone to my dad, who scrolled through the screenshots in silence. There were the hospital call logs, the Instagram posts, the comments from Megan's friends. He didn't say a word, but his face told me everything. My mom, meanwhile, broke down completely. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the evidence, shaking her head over and over. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "I don't understand." "I don't either," I admitted, my own voice breaking. "But it's the truth. Megan isn't sick, and she's been lying to you this whole time." For what felt like an eternity, none of us spoke. The room was filled with the sound of my mom's quiet sobs and the occasional creak of my dad's chair as he shifted uncomfortably. I could see the betrayal written all over their faces, and it broke my heart. When my dad finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "We'll talk to her," he said, though he sounded more defeated than resolute. But before I could respond, my mom interjected. "No," she said, wiping her eyes. "We need to think about this. Megan must have had her reasons. She wouldn't do this without a good reason." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, she lied to you about cancer," I said, my voice rising. "She let you think she was dying so you'd give her money. What reason could possibly justify that?" "Because she's our daughter," my mom said fiercely, her tears giving way to anger. "And we don't turn our backs on family, no matter what." Her words hit me like a slap. "So you're just going to forgive her? Pretend this never happened?" My dad looked at me, his expression weary. "What do you expect us to do?" he asked. "Disown her? Throw her out on the street? She's our child." That was the moment I realized they were going to forgive her, no matter what she'd done. It didn't matter how much she'd lied or how deeply she'd hurt them. To them, Megan was still their daughter, and that was all that mattered. "I don't know what to say," I said, standing up. "But you deserve better than this. You deserve the truth, and if you won't hold her accountable, then she's just going to keep doing this." "We'll handle it," my dad said, though his tone didn't inspire much confidence. As I left their house that night, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. I'd done what I could, but the rest was up to them. Whether they confronted Megan or swept everything under the rug, I couldn't control it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Megan wasn't the type to stop until she got what she wanted, and I had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. If I thought telling my parents the truth would put an end to Megan's lies, I couldn't have been more wrong. The fallout from that conversation was worse than anything I'd anticipated. Instead of holding Megan accountable, my parents doubled down on their loyalty to her, and somehow, I became the villain in my own family. A week after I told them the truth, Megan showed up at my parents' house. I wasn't there to witness the encounter, but my mom filled me in later. According to her, Megan came in tears, accusing me of invading her privacy and twisting the facts to make her look bad. She claimed the hospital must have made a mistake or lost her records, and that I'd overstepped by calling them in the first place. But the kicker? Megan didn't just deny the accusations. She flipped the narrative completely. She told my parents that I'd been jealous of her all my life, that I couldn't stand to see her getting attention, and that I'd gone out of my way to ruin her life. By the time my mom finished recounting Megan's side of the story, I could see the seeds of doubt had already taken root. "I just don't understand why you'd go to such lengths," she said, looking at me like I was a stranger. "Mom," I said, exasperated, "you saw the proof. You know she admitted it to me." She was upset, my mom said defensively. Maybe she said things she didn't mean. She's been under so much stress, and now she feels like her own family has turned against her. My dad, who'd been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "We've decided to give Megan the benefit of the doubt," he said, his tone firm. "She's going through a rough time, and we're not going to abandon her." "Abandon her?" I repeated, incredulous. "She lied to you about having cancer. She took your money and used it to fund her lifestyle. How is that not the issue here?" "She's our daughter," my mom said, her voice shaking. "We're not going to turn our backs on her." And just like that, it became clear where their loyalty lay. Over the next few weeks, the situation only got worse. Megan continued to spin her web of lies, painting herself as the victim and me as the cruel, heartless sibling who couldn't stand to see her happy. She played her role perfectly, oscillating between tearful apologies and fiery accusations, depending on what suited her narrative. I'd hear things through the family grapevine, comments Megan made at family gatherings, or phone calls she had with relatives. "She's just so bitter," she reportedly said to one aunt. "I don't know what I ever did to make her hate me so much." Somehow, she managed to twist the story to make it look like I was the one who'd betrayed her, not the other way around. It was maddening watching her rewrite history while I stood on the sidelines, powerless to stop it. But what hurt the most was my parents' reaction. Not only did they refuse to cut Megan off financially, but they actually gave her more money to get back on her feet. My mom even went as far as offering to help Megan move into a new apartment after she claimed her current place was too full of bad memories. When I brought up how unfair it was, my mom would sigh and say something like, "You just don't understand what she's going through." What she's going through? I'd shoot back. "She's not going through anything, Mom. She's making it up." But no matter how many times I said it, it was like talking to a brick wall. My parents were too entrenched in their denial, or maybe too afraid to face the truth, to see Megan for who she really was. Meanwhile, my relationship with them started to crumble. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, and every visit to their house was fraught with tension. It didn't matter what we were talking about: dinner plans, work, the weather. Everything felt loaded, as if one wrong word could set off an explosion. And then there was Megan. She acted as if nothing had happened, like she hadn't just scammed our parents out of thousands of dollars. She still showed up to family gatherings, smiling and laughing, as if she hadn't just destroyed the trust holding our family together. One day, I caught her smirking at me across the dinner table, a look that said, "I've won, and there's nothing you can do about it." It took every ounce of self-control I had not to call her out in front of everyone. I tried to move on with my life, to focus on my job and my friends and the things that made me happy. But it wasn't easy. Every time I saw my parents, I felt a pang of anger and sadness. I missed the way things used to be, before Megan's lies had driven a wedge between us. The worst part was the loneliness. I couldn't talk to my parents about how I was feeling because they didn't want to hear it. I couldn't talk to other family members because most of them had bought into Megan's narrative. I was isolated, left to stew in my own frustration and grief. But deep down, I knew one thing: Megan wasn't done. As long as she could keep manipulating our parents, she'd keep taking advantage of them. And as much as I wanted to wash my hands of the whole situation, I couldn't stand by and let her keep hurting the people I loved. I didn't know what my next move would be, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A year had passed since the fallout with Megan, and while things hadn't exactly gone back to normal, the dust seemed to have settled. My parents and I still had a strained relationship, but we managed to navigate family dinners and the occasional phone call without too much tension. Megan, of course, was still Megan, chirpy, carefree, and utterly unapologetic. Then came the conversation about the will. It was late one afternoon, during a rare visit to my parents' house. My dad, ever practical, brought it up in passing as we sat in the living room. "Your mom and I updated our will recently," he said, setting down his coffee cup. I looked up from my phone, not sure where this was going. "Oh, yes," my mom chimed in, her tone unnervingly casual. "We thought it was time, just to make sure everything is clear. We've decided to split everything equally between you and Megan." For a moment, I didn't respond. I thought I'd misheard them. Surely, they couldn't mean everything. Surely, they hadn't forgotten everything Megan had done. But when I looked at their faces, I saw no sign of doubt or hesitation. "Wait," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. "You're splitting everything equally? After everything that's happened?" My mom sighed, like she'd been expecting this reaction. "Yes, equally. We love you both, and we want to make sure you're both taken care of. But Megan doesn't deserve—" I stopped myself, taking a deep breath. "Do you really think that's fair? She's still your sister," my mom said firmly, "and she needs help more than you do." Those words stung more than I wanted to admit. "She needs help?" I asked, incredulous. "She's been living off you for years. She lied about having cancer, Mom. How does she deserve anything?" "She's our daughter," my dad said quietly, "and we're not going to leave her with nothing." I felt a wave of frustration rise in me, but I forced myself to stay composed. "This isn't about money," I said, trying to make them understand. "It's about what's right. Megan has manipulated you, lied to you, and stolen from you. How can you just overlook all of that?" "We're not overlooking it," my mom said, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "But people make mistakes. She's trying to move forward, and we're trying to help her do that." "Move forward?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "She hasn't apologized. She hasn't shown an ounce of remorse. She acts like none of it ever happened. How is that moving forward?" My dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not an easy decision," he admitted. "But at the end of the day, she's still family. And family forgives." There it was, that infuriating mantra that had been drilled into me since childhood. Family forgives. Family sticks together. No matter what. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to collect my thoughts. You're rewarding her for lying, I said finally. And you're punishing me for telling the truth. Do you realize how messed up that is? Nobody's punishing you, my mom said, her voice softening. We love you just as much as we love Megan. Then why does it feel like I'm the only one being held accountable for anything? Silence hung heavy in the room. My dad looked down at his hands, while my mom stared at me with a mixture of sadness and exasperation. This isn't about accountability, she said at last. It's about making sure both of you are okay after we're gone. We're not taking sides. But you are, I said, my voice cracking. By treating us the same, you're saying that what Megan did doesn't matter. That it's okay. They didn't have an answer for that. Or if they did, they didn't say it. Instead, my mom reached for my hand, her eyes pleading. Please don't let this come between us, she said. We're just trying to do what's best for the family. I pulled my hand away, unable to hide my frustration. What's best for the family? I repeated. What about what's best for you? Megan has bled you dry, and you're still bending over backward to make her happy. When does it stop? Neither of them responded. They just sat there, looking at me like I was the one tearing the family apart. I left the house that day feeling more alone than ever. It wasn't about the inheritance. I could care less about the money. It was the principle of it all. How could they look at Megan and me and think we deserve the same? How could they forgive her so easily while holding me at arm's length for doing the right thing? The whole situation felt like a cruel joke, and I was the only one who wasn't in on it. Megan had played them perfectly, and now she was going to walk away with everything she wanted: money, forgiveness, and a clean slate. And me? I was left to pick up the pieces, wondering if I'd ever be able to trust my parents or my sister again. The ultimatum came out of nowhere, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. I've been trying to reason with my parents, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd see the unfairness in their decision. But instead of listening to my concerns, they drew a line in the sand. It happened one evening during a tense phone call. I called my mom to try, once again, to explain how I felt about the inheritance situation. I laid it all out. How rewarding Megan after everything she'd done felt like a betrayal. How it made me question whether they valued honesty and accountability at all. But my mom wasn't having it. We've already made our decision, she said firmly. And we're not going to change it just because you don't agree. That's not what I'm asking, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. I'm asking you to think about what this says. About what it means to reward Megan after everything she's put us through. My dad, who rarely got involved in these conversations, suddenly spoke up. We've thought about it, he said, his tone colder than I'd ever heard. And if you can't accept our decision, then maybe you don't need to be a part of it at all. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, my heart pounding. It means, he said, that if you're going to make this such a big issue, we'll leave you out of the will entirely. We don't want this tearing the family apart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were willing to risk our relationship, to cut me out of their lives financially, and maybe even emotionally, all to protect Megan. This isn't about the money, I said, my voice trembling. This is about fairness. This is about not enabling her to keep manipulating you. It's not your place to decide what's fair, my mom snapped. You're being selfish, and you're letting your anger at Megan cloud your judgment. She's your sister, and she needs our help. No, she doesn't, I said, my frustration boiling over. She needs accountability. She needs to face the consequences of her actions, but instead, you're giving her a free pass. And now you're punishing me for pointing that out. The conversation escalated from there, spiraling into a heated argument that left all of us saying things we probably shouldn't have. My mom accused me of being cruel and judgmental, while I accused them of being blind to Megan's manipulation. My dad stayed mostly quiet, but his silence was just as painful as his words had been earlier. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. You know what? I said, my voice breaking. If this is how you're going to handle things, I don't want anything from you. Not the money, not the inheritance, none of it. Keep it. Give it all to Megan. I'm done. And with that, I hung up. Walking away from my parents that day was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. For as long as I could remember, they'd been my anchor, the people I turned to when things got tough. But now it felt like they'd chosen Megan over me, and I didn't know how to come back from that. I tried to focus on rebuilding my life without their involvement, but Megan wasn't about to let things die down. True to form, she played the victim card to perfection. She told everyone in the family that I'd turned my back on her and our parents because of money, that I was greedy and selfish and couldn't handle the idea of sharing. Some relatives bought into her story, which only made things worse. I started getting passive-aggressive comments from cousins and snide remarks at family events. One aunt even called me to lecture me about putting family first. It was exhausting, and I started withdrawing from family gatherings altogether. It just wasn't worth the drama. Megan, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. She continued to charm my parents, painting herself as the misunderstood daughter who just needed a little extra help. She still posted pictures of her lavish lifestyle on Instagram, flaunting the money she was siphoning from our parents. And my parents? They seemed to have made peace with the situation. They didn't reach out to me after the argument, and I didn't reach out to them. The silence between us was deafening, a painful reminder of how fractured our relationship had become. Every so often, I'd think about calling them, about trying to patch things up. But then I'd remember the ultimatum, the way they'd threatened to cut me out completely if I didn't fall in line. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what that threat represented. It was about how little they seemed to value my honesty and integrity compared to Megan's lies. Months passed, and the distance between us only grew. I focused on my work, my friends, and building a life that didn't revolve around family drama. But there was always a part of me that couldn't let go, that wondered if I'd made the right choice. Had I been too stubborn? Too uncompromising? Then again, what was the alternative? To keep pretending everything was fine, to keep enabling Megan and watching her drain my parents dry? I couldn't do it, and so I stayed away, hoping that one day they'd see Megan for who she really was. But deep down, I knew better. As long as Megan had them wrapped around her finger, nothing was going to change. News of the confrontation with my parents spread through our extended family like wildfire. It didn't take long for the story to morph, twisted by whispers and speculation. Every relative seemed to have a version of the events, and the details often depended on who they'd heard it from, Megan, my parents, or me. Unsurprisingly, Megan's version of the story painted her as the victim. According to her, I was the jealous sibling who had always resented her, and my accusations were a calculated attempt to ruin her life. She didn't outright deny the cancer lie, but she framed it as a cry for help born of desperation. "Don't you see how much she's struggling?" one aunt said during a particularly uncomfortable phone call. "You're holding this grudge, but she's trying to move forward. Why can't you just let it go?" Some relatives, however, weren't so easily convinced. A few of my cousins reached out to express their support, saying they couldn't believe Megan had taken things so far. "What she did is unforgivable," one cousin said. "I don't care what her excuses are. Lying about cancer is just evil." For a while, I tried to navigate the minefield of family dynamics. I attended a few gatherings, hoping things might smooth over with time. But every event felt like a battlefield. Some relatives were passive-aggressive, making snide comments about family loyalty or how I should just forgive and forget. Others were openly hostile, taking Megan's side and calling me selfish for dragging everything out. "Why can't you just move on?" one uncle said over Thanksgiving dinner, his voice dripping with irritation. "You're tearing this family apart." "I'm tearing it apart?" I shot back, unable to hide my frustration. "Megan lied about having cancer. She manipulated all of you. But sure, let's blame me for calling her out." The worst part, though, was how the fallout affected my relationship with my parents. They used to be my rock, the people I turned to for advice and support. But now, it felt like they didn't even see me anymore. Every conversation was tense, laced with subtle and not so subtle references to how I'd handled things poorly or let my anger get the best of me. My mom, in particular, seemed to have a talent for making me feel like the bad guy without outright saying it. "Your father and I just want peace," she said during one particularly charged phone call. "We've forgiven Megan. Why can't you?" "Because she hasn't shown any remorse," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "She's still lying, still manipulating you. How can you forgive someone who doesn't even think they've done anything wrong?" "She's trying," my mom insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, she's not," I said. "She's trying to save face, and you're letting her get away with it." My dad stayed silent throughout the conversation, but his lack of defense stung just as much as my mom's words. The tension came to a head during Christmas. I decided to attend, partly out of obligation and partly because I didn't want Megan to have the satisfaction of pushing me out entirely. The evening started off civil enough, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Megan arrived late, as usual, sweeping into the room with a practiced air of vulnerability. She hugged everyone as if nothing had happened, giving me a pointed smile that sent my blood boiling. Over dinner, the tension reached its breaking point. One of my uncles made a comment about family feuds ruining the holidays, and another relative chimed in about how holding grudges only hurts yourself. I bit my tongue for as long as I could, but when Megan chimed in with a faux innocent, "I just wish we could all move on," I snapped. "Move on?" I said, my voice cutting through the chatter. "You mean pretend like you didn't lie to everyone about having cancer? Like you didn't scam mom and dad out of thousands of dollars?" The room went silent. Megan's face turned red, but she recovered quickly. "I've already apologized," she said, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. "I can't change the past, but I'm trying to be better. I just don't understand why you can't let it go." "Because you haven't apologized," I said, my voice rising. "Not sincerely. Not once. You've played the victim this whole time, and everyone here is letting you get away with it." The fallout from that dinner was immediate. My parents pulled me aside afterward, furious that I'd ruined the holiday. "You didn't have to do that," my mom said, her voice shaking with anger. "She's trying to move forward, and you just keep dragging things back up because you're enabling her," I said, my own anger bubbling over. "You're letting her think what she did was okay, and it's not. We're trying to keep this family together," my dad said quietly. "No, you're trying to protect Megan at all costs," I shot back. "And you're willing to throw me under the bus to do it." That was the last time I attended a family gathering. Over the next few months, I distanced myself from everyone. It wasn't worth the drama, the backhanded comments, or the constant feeling of being the outsider in my own family. But the isolation was crushing. I missed the way things used to be, the laughter, the sense of belonging, the unconditional support I'd always taken for granted. Losing that felt like losing a part of myself, and I didn't know if I'd ever get it back. As much as I tried to focus on my own life, the pain of the fallout lingered. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone was a reminder of what I'd lost. And the worst part? Megan didn't seem to feel the weight of any of it. She carried on as if nothing had happened, basking in the love and forgiveness my parents and much of the family continued to shower her with. Meanwhile, I was left wondering if I'd ever truly belong again. The call from my mom came out of the blue, late one evening when I was unwinding with a cup of tea and trying to forget the weight of everything that had happened. Her name lit up on my phone, and for a moment I hesitated. Lately, every conversation with her felt like walking into an ambush, but part of me still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. "Hi, Mom," I said cautiously as I answered. "Hi, sweetheart," she replied, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. I know things have been hard, and I don't want us to keep drifting apart." Her words hit a tender spot, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of hope. "I don't want that either," I said. "But things need to change, Mom. We can't just keep sweeping everything under the rug." "I know," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "That's why I wanted to talk to you about the inheritance. I think it's a way for us to mend things." My stomach tightened. "What about it?" "Well," she said, hesitating, "we were hoping you might reconsider how it's split. Your father, and I think it would be good for you to share your portion with Megan. She's still struggling, and we want to make sure she's okay." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mom filled the silence, her voice taking on that soothing, persuasive tone she used when trying to sell an idea she knew I wouldn't like. "This isn't about taking anything away from you," she said. "It's about showing Megan that we're all still a family, that we support her as much as we support you. We thought it could be a gesture of goodwill, something to bring everyone back together." "A gesture of goodwill?" I repeated, my voice flat. "So, let me get this straight. You're asking me to give up part of what you've already decided to split equally so Megan, who lied to all of us, manipulated you, and got away with it, can have even more? That's not fair, honey," she said, her tone shifting to a defensive edge. "She's had a hard time. We're just trying to help her get back on her feet." "She's always had a hard time, according to you," I snapped. "And every time, you've bailed her out. When does it end, Mom? When do you stop enabling her and start holding her accountable?" My mom's voice wavered. "You don't understand what it's like to see your child in pain. She's made mistakes, but she's still our daughter. We have to support her. And what about me?" I shot back, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "Do you even see how much this has hurt me? How much it's cost me to be the only one who stood up to her? Or am I just the scapegoat you throw under the bus to keep the peace?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, my mom said, "We don't want to lose you, but this is about the whole family. We just need you to be the bigger person." The bigger person. That phrase sent a surge of rage through me. I'd spent years being the bigger person, watching Megan lie, manipulate, and take advantage of everyone around her, while I bit my tongue for the sake of family harmony. But this was too much. I can't do this anymore, Mom, I said, my voice breaking. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay, that what Megan did doesn't matter. And I can't keep letting you use me to clean up her messes. That's not what we're doing, she insisted, but I could hear the guilt creeping into her voice. It is, I said firmly. You've been doing it for years, and I've let it slide because I love you. But this is the line. If you can't see how wrong this is, if you're willing to sacrifice your relationship with me to protect her, then I don't know what else to say. Please don't do this, she said, her voice cracking. We just want to make things right. You can't make things right by asking me to compromise my principles, I said. I'm done being the scapegoat, Mom. I'm done. And with that, I hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there staring at my phone, half expecting her to call back. But she didn't. In the days that followed, I waited for some kind of resolution, for my parents to reach out, for Megan to show even a shred of accountability, for something to shift. But nothing changed. Megan continued to play the victim. My parents continued to coddle her, and I remained the outsider. It hurt more than I cared to admit. I'd always thought of my family as unshakable, a foundation I could rely on no matter what. But now, that foundation felt irreparably cracked. As much as I miss my parents, I knew walking away was the right decision. Staying in that toxic dynamic would have destroyed me, and I deserved better. I still think about them sometimes, about the way things used to be, about the love we shared before Megan's lies drove a wedge between us. And maybe one day, things will change. Maybe they'll see Megan for who she really is. Maybe they'll reach out and try to make amends. But until then, I've made my peace with the decision to let go. Because sometimes love isn't enough. And sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away.